We turn now to the topic of classic rock. It's always been there, right? Well, it turns out that classic rock was in many ways a kind of radio creation that in a minute we'll talk about as being developed in the 1980s through radio consultants and spreading as a radio kind of format. But let's talk a little bit about what was happening in the 1990s and the 1980s and 90s that really sort of prepare the way for what we might call the sort of creation of rock history in many ways. One of the most important events of the 1980s is the transfer of, or the changeover in technology from analog recordings, cassette tapes, and vinyl records to CD. This starts to happen in late 1982 as the two big companies, Sony and Philips, sort of combine forces to develop CD technology and to standardize it. You know, the original claims that were made about CDs it was a tremendous improvement in audio quality. When you listen to a CD, you were getting the very best quality, something that with an analog system you'd have had to pay lots and lots of money for. With a simple CD player, you can get all of that kind of fidelity. It's digital, so the information never wears out or wears down. You know, actual vinyl records do kind of wear out. You can wear a record out and it starts to sound not as good after you've played it a bunch of times. And the idea was that CDs are forever, they're perfect, they're digital, it's all good. And so what they started to do is they started to try to talk consumers into rebuying all the music they already had on record on CD. And well, you wouldn't think that kind of thing would work, but actually it did. And people did start to buy the records again on CD, because not only were they supposed to be re-released with better audio quality, but they very quickly found out that if you just added a couple of bonus tracks, things that people didn't already have on the CD, heck, you could get them to buy the whole record all over again and at twice the price. A pretty sweet deal for the record companies. And during the 80s, once they got this CD transition going into the 90s, they were making tons and tons of money. It was a real boom for them, this transfer shift to CD. And it also became a time when people began to realize that they could sell tremendous amount of back catalog. That is, stuff that had already been recorded years ago. The cost on it had already been covered, so now it was almost entirely pure profit. But we had to repackage it in some way. We talked about bonus tracks with CDs, but then these box sets start coming out. Well, box sets in classical music had been the norm back when everybody was using records, even really going back to the original record, 78 albums were a kind of a box set. The idea of putting a bunch of music together. But here, you not only give people a bunch of music that they already like, but you give them some stuff that they haven't heard before, previously unreleased or bonus tracks, and then you give them a little booklet that kind of explains all the sort of context around it, give them important recording dates and personnel, and make it look very much like a kind of a musicology, a kind of a pop musicology, to give people a kind of almost a kind of a scholarly interest in this music. And so in the late 80s into the 90s, you get this explosion as part of the CD boom of a lot of material that really is sort of historically based, almost like sort of collectors or archivists, as we sort of pull together these box sets and these new CDs with extensive notes, and bonus tracks. At the same time as that's happening, oh, by the way, with regard to CD reissues, one thing that the record companies didn't plan on is the technology of digitizing a tune. That worked great for them during the 90s when they could get people to pay $16.99 because there was one song on the CD they wanted. But by the end of the decade, the beginning of the 21st century, when Napster came along and figured out a way to take those digital files and share them on the internet, the game was almost up right from the get-go. The idea of sharing MP3s on the internet quickly has seriously eroded the status of the music business. But that's a story for another day. So while all this CD reissuing was going on, there was some radio formatting and consulting going on. Now, radio consultants were nothing new. Top 40 was organized by radio consultants who worked nationally. In other words, they would go to a station and say, here's a format, here are the songs you should play, here's how you should do it, this is what will get you the maximum audience. Of course, if you're able to get the maximum audience, you can charge more for your advertising. So that's really what commercial radio is about, selling you advertising. They're giving you the music to keep you listening so you can hear the ads. A guy at the end of the 1970s who was very famous for sort of establishing the FM radio playlists is a guy by the name of Lee Abrams. But the classic rock format is developed by a fellow named Fred Jacobs in the mid-1980s. The first classic rock station goes on the air in Lansing, Michigan in 1985. But by the end of the 80s, it's a securely established radio format, and every town has got at least one classic rock station, if not maybe 2 or 3. What classic rock does is it gives you the impression that you're listening to radio back in the 70s, back in the heyday, right? Except that all of the songs that are played probably still have to be only 4 minutes long. And they're really picking and choosing just those things that they think people will continue listening to. Because remember, the whole idea of having a format is keeping people listening. So, well, some stations have tried to develop a kind of a deep tracks format where they've tried to include other kinds of things that you might have heard back in the 70s. But the most successful approach for a long time was really to do almost a kind of classic rock top 40 radio, giving you the impression you were back in the 70s listening to radio, but actually with playlists that probably never really existed that way in the 1970s. What it did is it, together with this CD reissue thing, it made people think about rock radio in terms of think about rock music in terms of its history, in terms of the way in which groups started to become kind of, as we say, canonized. Certain songs became sort of canonic. They were the ones that sort of represented the repertory of late 60s, 70s, and early 80s rock and roll. In addition to that, we get the emergence of the first really important or commercial rockumentaries. Rockumentaries had been done certainly going all the way back to the documentary of Bob Dylan or the band's The Last Waltz. We can think of a number of ones. But what really starts to happen is on MTV and VH1, they become the leading proponents of certain kinds of programming that really sort of lends itself to sort of historical interest. So for example, on VH1 in 1996, you get the debut of pop-up video. So you're watching a video, probably a video you've seen a million times, but there are all these little sort of facts popping up. Some of them are really interesting facts, some of them are just silly, and they're really there for your amusement. They can become rather addicting because it's kind of a fun thing to watch, as even music that you don't very much like by artists you don't care very much, the pop-up video for it is actually kind of cool and fun. Other shows that are released in 1997 that play a big role, Behind the Music and Legends, both of them sort of devoted to kind of quasi-historical surveys of an individual artist and their career. Interestingly, if you look at a bunch of these, you begin to see certain patterns emerge. One of them is that no matter how many times you watch Behind the Music or Legends, hardly any of the music by the artist they're talking about is ever included, because of course that would need to be licensed, and that makes it more expensive to produce. So here they are talking about the career of an artist and hardly playing any of their music. And the thing is that every one of them follows a kind of a predictable rags to riches kind of story, early beginnings, rise to fame, first success, tragedy strikes, where are they now? The story is almost always the same in these things. Is that because everybody's career was really the same? No, but it's the kind of story we like to hear. And remember, these things are historically flavored entertainment, not really history. But to that end, they get people interested in history and interested in learning a lot more. They develop a real sort of sense of rock history. In 1995, there are two big sort of multi-video sets that are released about the history of rock, one from Time Life and one from PBS, each of them 10 episodes of roughly about an hour apiece that survey the entire history of rock music. Those are for people now who are really starting to get interested in the history of rock music. And then you get in 1995, late 1995, the release of the Beatles anthology. First on commercial TV, there was a multi-evening special showing at the end of 1995, and then on a much expanded sort of videos, you get the history of the Beatles told by the Beatles themselves. So you see that by the second half of the 1990s, all kinds of forces are conspiring together to create this sense that rock has a history, it's an important and interesting history, and here are various kinds of things you can buy or shows you can watch that can get you involved in this. And to a certain extent, university courses start to pop up all over the place because now this all seems a lot more legitimate. And well, here we are on Coursera talking about the history of rock music. In many ways, it's a kind of a consequence of some of these things that were happening through the rise of classic rock radio and the rise of this kind of rockumentary, rock history kind of mentality in the 1990s. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the establishment of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was established already back in 1983, but the actual building in Cleveland opens in 1995, the same year as the Beatles anthology is released, the PBS and Time Life series are released, and the next year pop-up videos start, and the next year after that, 1997, Behind the Music and Legend starts. So you see, it all kind of comes together. By the year 2000 in Seattle, the Experience Music Project opens, and we've got 2 big museums and all of this stuff going on celebrating the history of rock music. Well, it wasn't just that rock's history was available in all the kinds of ways that I've been talking about, but older musicians were still popular in the 1990s. That is, they didn't just go away or stop being in the music business or open up an insurance company or a car dealership or some kind of thing like that after they'd been in the limelight. No, a lot of these musicians not only stayed in the music business, but continued to have pretty good success. So here's a quick list of some. From the 1960s, you of course got the Beatles returning with 2 new songs used by creating old tracks that had been recorded by John Lennon, then adding the other 3 Beatles on, Free as a Bird and Real Love in 1995, 1996. We've got the Rolling Stones having a big album in 1994 with Voodoo Lounge. I mean, I'm talking #2 on the pop charts, #1 in the UK. Eric Clapton's Unplugged album from 1992, a #2 album here, #2 in the UK, with a big single on it, Tears in Heaven. So Clapton, the Stones, the Beatles, all still on the charts in the 1990s. From the 1970s, you've got Peter Gabriel. His album from 1992, Us, goes to #2 on both sides of the Atlantic. Santana is back with an album called Supernatural, #1 on both sides of the Atlantic, and that song, Smooth, a #1 hit, featuring Rob Thomas from Matchbox 20. On lead vocals. We'll talk about them in just a little bit. So you've got artists from the 60s, artists from the 70s who are having success in the 90s, artists from the 80s, Sting with 10 Summoner's Tales in 1993, Bruce Springsteen with his greatest hits in 1995, #1 on both sides of the Atlantic, and U2 with Zooropa, #1 on both sides of the Atlantic in 1993. The thing is, by the mid-1990s, every new release didn't just compete with other new releases. They competed with other albums from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. If you brought a new record out, you just didn't have to compete with the attention of other new records that were out that week. You had to compete with this whole catalog of rock music that was being re-released through 3D reissue, CD reissue. And new artists didn't just have to compete with other new artists, they had to compete with a whole other generations of artists for attention. So if you're a new artist in the mid-1990s, you got to compete with Paul McCartney, Eric Clapton, Peter Gabriel, and Bruce Springsteen to get any attention. And so we see this kind of layering now of the rock public and an interest in history and a kind of a real kind of segmenting out of rock culture. Rock culture starts to become something that you don't just give up after you get out of your 20s or something like that. People hang with it throughout their lives, and including to the present day, people are still listening to music. You're taking this course, listening and thinking about music from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. All of this stuff really starts to come together in the 1990s. So having talked about the presence of rock's history in our awareness of rock music, let's turn now to a survey of some groups that I call the new rock traditions.